Welcome everyone to the Keynote Panel. We're going to discuss basically very broadly the extent to which human rights considerations have entered into the economy. We have four, you only see three on stage, but we have four speakers for the panel. Christina Kokkinakis, who's right next to me, ambassador. You're the EU ambassador to the OECD and UNESCO, but you've worked throughout your career on human rights and several human rights dialogues at the UN, etc. We have Ignacio García Bercero, who worked at DG Trade in his last posting on multilateral affairs, but also throughout your career on human rights, trade and sustainable development, relationships with North America, with Southeast Asia. So really happy to have you both. Siobhán, McInerney, you've worked at the World Bank on human rights, and now you work at the EU's Fundamental Rights Agency. So maybe also you can explain, because it's a relatively new agency to people, what the agency does. Really happy to have you. And then online, I don't know if you can hear us, Laura Piovesan.
Yes, good morning, everyone.
Perfect, good morning. Who's the Director General at the Project Directorate for the EIB, the European Investment Bank. Really happy to have you as well. And maybe we can start with Siobhán. You can give us an overview, both of the Fundamental Rights Agency work and also, this idea of how important are human rights in investment and finance.
Great. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm really so pleased to be here at this very important conference, not least because of the themes that are front and center of it that I've been thinking about for many years, both in my scholarship but also in the work that I did at the World Bank, where I was counsel in the legal department for 20 years, and now in my role at the EU Fundamental Rights Agency. I think the themes in particular that I'm drawn to are, of course, fragmentation of international law, which seems to be a red thread throughout your conference, policy coherence, but also accountability, which is something that I'll come back to in my remarks. Back to the theme of the conference, so conflict to cooperation. As I reflected on that theme and thought about my years of practice and my own perspective as an international lawyer, I was thinking that my experience had not attested so much to conflict as to fragmentation and disconnects. So more in line with Philip Alston's famous analogy of ships in the night, at least from the perspective of development finance law, so international economic law governing development policy. The problems had been related more to the absence or paucity of engagement rather than outright conflict. So more a story of siloing and neglect. Partly, I think, a function, a result of how exponentially development policies have grown. So IFIs in particular, extremely broad coverage, very elaborate development policy and procedural frameworks that almost dispense at some point with the need to engage with other regimes. If you're covering literally everything that other specialized agencies might have mandate for you, really, there isn't a huge need. I would argue that there should be, but there's not a recognized need to engage. And often, as is well known between the worlds of development and human rights, the engagement had been sporadic, not always very positive, not very constructive, and I think, unfortunately, a sustained lack of understanding of the discourses governing each of the spheres. I think, again, going back to the example of IFI policies, which could, I think, be, there are lessons and challenges, I think, that can be drawn out there and applied to other areas of international economic law. But as I mentioned, these are policies that have a very broad coverage substantively. They're covering almost every area, for example, governed by the two covenants, for instance. And they exert an outsized influence on the governance and policies and laws in developing countries, but they're not grounded in international law. They're just not grounded in treaties. So there's no real engagement or uptake of international law or obligations. Instead, much more of a soft approach in terms of using proxies or principles, soft considerations. There'll be the ad hoc references to international treaties here and there, but I would argue, and I've written elsewhere and been very vocal in my previous job, that the approach was not systematic. And so, for example, with human rights, there would be permission to take human rights considerations into account, but no requirement to uphold obligations, and those are two very different things. So moving to what that results in, I mean, my view is that at best it results in a dilution, or what Peter Uven called rhetorical repackaging, where an IFI or a development actor will take a human rights concept and sort of, you know, bankify it and then spit it out as its own policy. But at worst, you have a subversion and confusion around a human rights law and accountability. It allows certain international economic actors to say, we're doing it already, we just don't use the language of rights, which in my view completely misses the point of human rights. You need to ground human rights accountability in the language, the explicit language of rights and obligations, and crucially, you need to recognize it as law, so binding law. Let me just move to a few quick reflections in terms of, great that I've presented this massive problem, what would be my approach? So what would I propose? So again, over the years of thinking and working in this space, I have thought a lot about instrumental arguments or moral arguments for bringing human rights considerations into account more explicitly. And I think those can be effective, and certainly they're not mutually exclusive. All of the distinguished panel will have experience leveraging these arguments in different ways. You have to be agile and smart in what you mobilize, and it's not a zero-sum game. But maybe what I would leave you with is that what I've come back to thinking is that rather than arguing for alignment, we should rely on a much simpler legal argument. It's the law, and there shouldn't be any equivocation around that. One should try to undertake some form of public international law due diligence. So when a decision is made in the economic or development space, one should be considering which are the relevant and applicable legal obligations under international law. I think there's a need for a coherent interpretative approach, and a need for human rights obligations to be respected in decisions made in the space of international economic law. And there's no assumption that the latter obligations should take precedence over human rights law. A few final thoughts, I think, at the operational level, so going from the legal argument a bit more to the operational level. In discussions with Holger, we'd agreed that, of course, the law may be fragmented and siloed, but global challenges are not, and the reality is deeply interconnected. So I think there's a need for an active recognition and understanding of concurrent obligations. These are the same member states that have ratified and are states parties to human rights law treaties as those who engage in development financing or in investment agreements and treaties. I think there's a need, though, to recognize the importance of partnerships and the distinct and complementary roles of different actors. Not every actor should be in every space, but that does rely on not carving up the international arena, but at least recognizing and leveraging different actors' comparative advantage and recognizing the distinctions and the limitations of mandate. So I think a clear need for cooperation. Not all actors can or should do everything. I have some more reflections, but I think I've gone probably well enough for the opening reflections.
It's great for already a lot of questions for the discussion. I guess the main takeaway is that you know, this idea that the enforcement is, if there is any enforcement, it's very soft and it's not systematic. It's not really interwoven in at least in development finance, and that the respect for human rights as the law is not, actually the current practice might be chipping away at that respect. Christina, I guess it's a bit the opposite in the case of your work, but maybe you can give us a brief introduction, and then we can discuss a bit more about these challenges.
Right. Hanke, thanks a lot, and many thanks for having my.
Can you hear me? Yes. So good morning. Many thanks, Hanke, and many thanks for having invited me to this important conference. Thanks also to the Diplomatic Academy, to the Deputy Director. She had another appointment. I studied in this very house many years ago. I will disclose when, because I don't have a problem with that. From 93 till 95, so I'm part of the 30th promotion of the Diplomatic Academy, and I'm very happy every time to be back in this house. Maybe a couple of points, and maybe taking, let's say, le relais of what the colleague from the Fundamental Rights Agency just said. We're discussing human rights today. And I mean, I think one point should be clear for all of us: human rights are the law. So there is really nothing that, and we should not be in any position of not accepting that. Why? Last year we commemorated 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This year we are in the 76th year. And this year, I think, is a year of opportunities, also in terms of human rights, when it comes also to economics. Last year, we also commemorated 30 years of the Vienna Declaration Program of Action, and it is also part of your logo. Here I see, and I'd like to refer to that because basically it underlines four main important points when it comes to human rights. One is universality of human rights. Second one is the interdependence. Third, the indivisibility and the interrelatedness between human rights. So what does that mean concretely? That means that we have, and that's what already alluded to, that we have two covenants when it comes to human rights: a covenant on civil and political rights and a covenant on economic, social and cultural rights. And these two are interdependent, and this is indivisible for everyone who has signed up to the UDHR. All UN member states have signed up 76 years ago. There was a reconfirmation in 1993. And this is also at the DNA of the European Union and of our human rights policy. So what does that mean correctly? You cannot do civil and political rights without doing economic, social and cultural rights, and vice versa. So let me give you a concrete example. Very often we are facing as EU a criticism that we are just pushing for civil and political rights. First, it's not true, and second, it doesn't make any sense anymore. You cannot argue for a classical civil and political rights, such as the right to vote, for instance, without having done enough on the other side, on the economic, social and cultural rights. Relating to infrastructure, for instance, people need to be able to join where they will vote, etc. So these two things are interconnected. Now, we heard in the welcoming message this morning by the High Commissioner for Human Rights a lot about this human rights economy. This is a call that has been there for a couple of years now, a call by the UN Secretary General and by the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So, and this is something we as EU fully support. This means that when it comes to business models, when it comes to investment decisions, to economic policies, to trade treaties, where I suppose Ignacio then will come back to it, we need to have a human rights-based approach. Let me also, this approach needs to be guided by standards and norms, and let me underline already at the beginning of our discussion that we have everything we need. Yeah? So we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We have, that was reconfirmed by the VDPA. So my main first point would be we need to implement what we have on the table. So if I needed to mention three priorities, it would be implementation, implementation, and implementation of what we have on the table. And we need to push back on all the pushbacks against universality of human rights, and this is a very clear point. Now, I mentioned that this year is a year of opportunities. It is because we are acting in this global framework of the Summit of the Future, of a Revision 1 that was circulated last week of a declaration that will lead to the Pact of the Future that will be decided upon end of September in New York. If you have had a look at that, it's a document which is being built against the background of the SDGs, of the Sustainable Development Goals, and of the implementation of the SDGs. And there, the economic part is an inherent part of how we need to implement the SDGs and what can we do in order to reform the international financial system. Maybe to mention also what we already have on the table, and I will come back, well, I will start maybe with EU. So we have EU trade agreements, free trade agreements, GSP+, etc., where maybe Ignacio will say a couple of things, with human rights clauses. We have the EU due diligence directive, which is an important part in this whole framework, trying to create more transparency, more trust in international businesses, and also try to mainstream human rights for all that. We have, when it comes to the UN, the guiding principles on business and human rights. We have some guidelines at the OECD as well for multinational enterprises on responsible business conduct, and UNESCO, just to name, because I'm also accredited to UNESCO. UNESCO, together with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, called for an establishment of university chairs on human rights economy. I think this is an interesting element for us. I think I leave it at this for the time being, and I'm happy to discuss.
Thanks, Christina. I thought it was an interesting point that, you know, economic rights, or at least a certain basic level of development, might be a necessary condition for political rights, or for some political rights. But it's definitely not sufficient or automatic. And what we're seeing a lot now, and I want to discuss that a bit later with all of you, is big countries such as China pushing back and only focusing on, you know, on economic and development rights, but not on the political rights. So that's an interesting discussion. Before we forget our online participant, I want to turn to Laura, and maybe you can give us an overview of your work with human rights, and then we turn to Ignacio, and then we can have a discussion.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. Apologies for not being there in person. Can you confirm you hear me well? Perfect, okay. Thank you very much. I also want to say a few words of introduction, particularly focusing on the role of the European Investment Bank, but also more broadly of multilateral development banks when it comes with regards to human rights. Before doing that, maybe a short introduction on the fact that, as you, I'm sure you know, the European Investment Bank is the Bank of the European Union, and for this reason, respect for the human dignity, freedom, equality, and respect for human rights are some of the founding principles of the EU, and therefore also core for the European Investment Bank. This is not only a policy commitment, this, as it has been mentioned, it is law. So the European Investment Bank is legally bound by the provision of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. Our commitments to human rights is not new. What is new, and what I think it's important to acknowledge, is how this, what is changing is how we approach the question, in particularly, and it was mentioned, of businesses and human rights, and the fact that this has an increasingly high profile. And why is this the case? What is changing? Well, first of all, it has been mentioned, the geopolitical situation. So these values are not universally shared and are under particular threat at the moment. There is also, on the other hand, a strong interest from responsible investors to ensure that we move towards sustainable businesses and sustainable finance. So a push for more accountability and more transparency. And finally, what is changing is also the translation of these principles and values into common rule books and legislation, an area where European Union is leading, but it's not limited to the European Union, and where we see an increased focus on disclosure and risk management from the investors, as I mentioned, and supervisors. So in this evolving context, what is the role of the European Investment Bank? What is the role of multilateral development banks? And I do see this role as threefold. So 3 points. First, doing no harm through our financing. Second, promoting human rights by investing in projects, by contributing to building peaceful and stable societies. For example, this is driving our approach in our intervention in Ukraine. And third, providing leadership for the market, what can be done and how we operationalize, indeed, these legal requirements. And let me just touch upon these 3 areas, but I'll be brief because indeed I'm looking forward to a very fruitful debate. So the first area I mentioned, doing no harm. So we do not approach human rights as a standalone issue. We look at human rights as an integral part and an integrated approach in our due diligence, which includes the environmental, the social, and the climate due diligence. And by doing so, we approach the entire project cycle. So we finance projects. And so from the inception, the preparation, to the due diligence, to the approval steps, to the implementation of these projects through a human rights lenses. In addition to that, human rights are also, of course, at the core of our engagement with stakeholders. We need to be informed by a dialogue during the project preparation and on our policies with civil societies in a way which is transparent and responsible. Now, of course, it's not only important what we do during the due diligence phase in assessing the risks, but also how we manage this risk when they materialize in the course of the process. And in the context of what I've said before, of this evolving landscape, I think an area which is particularly challenging, but also interesting and important to tackle is the human rights in the context of the supply chain. So this is an area, it was mentioned, of legislative focus. So we welcome very much the new Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive and the EU forced labor legislation. And these are crucial pieces that would allow, indeed, to mainstream best practices and strengthening the role of the multilateral banks on assessing and developing a joint and common approach in defining best practices in this area. So the first principle I mentioned, do no harm, but of course, the second key principle is about doing good. So not only we should aim at managing, assessing and managing the risks in the projects where we invest, but I think it's also very important and driving for us in our consideration the criteria of investing in projects that strengthen human rights, so with a positive approach. And we, as a EU climate bank, we see a lot of importance in not putting any trade-off between objectives, and there are some discussions about, for example, social and climate, which appear at times to be almost in conflict, but in fact, there is we put a particular focus on addressing just transition, so financing projects which provide new job and opportunities for people and communities which are more vulnerable to climate change, but also ensuring that the benefits of positive climate projects also benefits and are designed in a way that benefit and not harm vulnerable communities. So projects we finance in the areas also in terms of positive impact of social housing, water sector, health and education help to strengthen human rights. Examples of recent examples, for example, focusing on vulnerable populations like Ukrainian refugees, to offer targeted support. This is a type of intervention we have been investing recently. Beyond the financing, what EIB can contribute, what Multilateral Development Bank can contribute is advisory services. So in order to support the design of investments that help strengthen human rights. And let me give you an example. So we recently provided advisory services to the city of Barcelona in terms of monitoring and measuring the impact of harassment prevention plans to increase the accessibility of transport services. Similarly, we have been working with the city of Bologna to ensure gender and social perspectives are integrated into future urban projects. When having this approach towards supporting positive impact, two elements are important. First, demonstrating intentionality, and second, the measurement. It's of course key to have very clear, measurable, accountable criteria in order to avoid social washing. The third area in the role of the Multilateral Development Bank is the market leadership. I mentioned Multilateral Development Bank can provide indeed advisory services, but most importantly, can lead by example in our own financing. So we are developing, in terms of advisory on approaches, we are developing, for example, a toolkit for financial institutions with UNEP on integrating human rights consideration into financing. We are also working on developing guidance for the promoters of our projects, but an area where we do see an important role for the bank is also bringing together the full support of responsible and engaged capital markets. I think we are hearing a lot in Europe about the importance of the capital market union. And as I mentioned, there is an increased interest of responsible investors and responsible and engaged capital markets on sustainability. We, alongside our climate awareness bond, where we have been pioneer, we issue sustainability awareness bonds. And this allows us to establish a direct link between our lending and the global investors. Our sustainability awareness bond covers the sector I mentioned before: housing, education, health, water. And we see a lot of interest in the market for our issuance in this area, which demonstrates also the value of our market leadership position and our approach. These are my introductory words, and of course, I'm looking forward to hearing the next speaker, but also to the debate afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Laura. And I want to discuss in a minute with you and Siobhán about the practice of human rights enforcement. Questions like, if in a case of a clear human rights violations, would the bank pull out? And also, with the EIB now preparing to finance weapons, what would happen if human rights violations are committed with these weapons? So these kind of questions. But first, let's turn to Ignacio García Bercero. I also would like to hear, of course, from you, from your experience in DG Trade and the relationship there with human rights and the different tools for enforcement.
No, thanks a lot, Jakob, and it's a big pleasure to be here. Now, I will talk on a purely personal capacity. I'm no longer working for DG Trade and happily retired since the 1st of April. And I will not talk primarily as a lawyer. I think there's going to be some very good discussions this afternoon about WTO law, about international trade law. I would talk more as a trade policy practitioner. And I would like to give you a sense about how much human rights-related considerations have been a part of trade policy in the course of my career of 40 years in the Commission. And for me, I would really differentiate between the two phases. If I look into my first 20 years as a DG Trade or Commission official, I would say human rights were there. They were certainly something that we were very conscious that we would have to take into account as we develop our trade policy initiative, but they were very much something external to DG Trade. That would be something that other people within the Commission, when we had the RELEX, or the EIS would handle. So, for instance, human rights clauses is something that has been in trade agreements since the early 90s. But human rights clauses are basically negotiated by the EIS, and the EIS who is responsible for managing the implementation of those clauses through human rights dialogue. Now, that doesn't mean that we as trade policy practitioners do not need to take those into account. If I can give you an anecdote, when I was actually negotiating the free trade agreement with Korea, the EIS was negotiating in parallel a political agreement. And this political agreement had to include a human rights clause that would have the legal capacity to suspend trade concessions under the trade agreement. So it was a little bit difficult for the Koreans to agree, to accept, and at some point in time, my colleague from the EIS said, you should really talk with your counterpart in Korea, because he seems to be the big problem for Korea to accept this clause. I had to explain why this is so important for the European Union, how it is going to be implemented in practice, how it can be done in a manner which respects the principle of proportionality, etc., etc. But all of this is basically something essentially handled by the foreign policy part of the European Union, and which is a little bit external to the trade. Now, in my view, something quite fundamentally changed around 2007, and that was the consequence of two political decisions. The one was that we entered into a new phase of negotiation of comprehensive trade agreements. And we took the view that these comprehensive trade agreements should integrate a sustainable development component. So a trade and sustainable development chapter that would incorporate, on the one hand, protection of the environment, and the other hand, protection of core labor rights. And that became, from that moment in time, a core part of the activities of DG Trade. And of course, both the protection of the environment and core labor rights are closely connected with human rights, because they are part of human rights. So from that point of view, I think that aspect of the policy has been quite central to the activities of DG Trade. And of course, it has evolved a lot since the first time that we negotiated these provisions in a trade agreement. That was the case of Korea. There has been, in 2022, a review of our policy where we decided to introduce a number of new elements. And just to give you an indication about why this is now quite central, you increasingly have DG Trade having to handle the complaints about behavior in a certain country which is not in line with human rights provisions under the trade agreements. And we need to be able to investigate those, to take a decision about how to give them follow-up. I mean, so far we have had one case, which I would argue was quite successful, that was brought vis-à-vis Korea, because Korea has failed to ratify 3 of the core ILO conventions, despite commitment that it had taken when we negotiated the trade agreement. And following the dispute settlement case under the Korea FTA, Korea has already ratified 2 of the 3 conventions that it had not ratified. There are still discussions concerning the third one. Now, more recently, there has been a complaint by a European NGO, but on behalf of organizations in the partner countries, about labor rights in the mining sector in Colombia and Peru. And that has led to an investigation, which for the time being, there has been an agreement with Peru about the number of actions that they will be taken in order to improve the human rights situation in the mining sector. And very recently, but I cannot give any details because it's still under being processed, it is likely that there will be a complaint about human rights, labor rights situation in Vietnam. So all of these areas are areas which is DG Trade that is responsible for managing the implementation of these sustainable development chapters. Is DG Trade, therefore, that has to handle these aspects of our relationship with those countries in the field of human rights. So that's one factor that has made human rights-related issues more internal, if you want, to the policy making in the trade policy field. The other is, of course, the development of autonomous tools that have a human right purpose, but which actually use trade as an instrument to achieve a human rights objective. I mean, the first and very important tool was, of course, the reform of the European GSP, which, by the way, for the little history, was the consequence of us having lost a panel in the WTO. And then in order to comply with our WTO obligation, we need an objective basis in order to differentiate between different developing countries. And the objective should be to what extent those countries have ratified and are effectively implementing the core human rights conventions. And that has been part of our GSP for the last almost 20 years. And it includes both positive and negative conditionalities when it comes to the implementation of the GSP. Countries that can receive better treatment because they have ratified and they are implementing the conventions, but also the possibility of withdrawing the GSP treatment if there is evidence of serious problems relating to the human rights situation. Now, more recently, of course, I think you have an even perhaps more significant development, which I think you have already referred to, Christina. There is the forced labor legislation with the prohibition to market in the European Union products which are linked to forced labor, and which has been a legislation that has been in a way co-managed by DG Trade and DG Grow. So it is not something that is done by some other service within the European Commission. It is something that, because of the significant trade impact, DG Trade has been one of the key DGs involved in the management of this legislation through the process of legislation in the European Parliament and in the Council, and where DG Trade will also have to play a role when it comes to the implementation, which, by the way, can be a challenge because it's actually something that, in terms of how this is going to be implemented, I think there's quite a few questions that would arise there. And of course, even bigger in terms of the potential significance on human rights is the corporate due diligence legislation, because this is not just limited to forced labor, it is much broader on application. Now, this is not a trade tool. This is something that has been basically developed by our colleagues in DG Just, but it's clear that it's something that's increasingly going to have an impact also in our trade relations with a very significant number of countries that will have questions about how this legislation is going to be implemented, what is the risk that the legislation may represent for their trade with the European Union. And of course, if you take a broad view of human rights and you also bring in the environmental dimension, then you have a number of legislations in the European Union, like the Carbon Border Adjustment Measure, like the deforestation legislation. So all of these legislations can have a very significant impact on trade. So just to conclude, three issues which I think I just put for reflection, because I'm not sure I have a clear answer to them, but I think there are going to be important questions as we look into this interface between trade and human rights. The first one is why it is that we want trade policy to be more actively involved in the promotion of human rights. Is it basically because we want to use trade policy as an enforcement mechanism? Is it because the possibility of sanctions being there at the end of a trade policy procedure? Or is it more because we think that trade policy can create also better channels of communication and cooperation with developing countries, as you are increasingly legislating on areas that would have a trade impact and which are connected to human rights? So is it basically about enforcement, or is it basically about creating additional opportunities for cooperation? Very much connected to this is how we are going to be handling our policy in relations with democratic countries in the Global South, how to ensure that what we do is not being perceived as somehow being neocolonial, if I can use a somewhat provocative word. And I think that how we handled our relationships with the countries in the Global South in this whole trade human rights interface is going to be one of the critical issues. And then there's this whole question about the interface between what the public authorities do and the responsibilities of business, which is the consequence of the due diligence legislation. As we come now to implementing this in practice, what it is that should be done by the business, what it is that should be done by the public authorities. And again, I don't have an answer to that, but I think it's one of the key questions which I think we are going to be having to tackle as we go deeper into these questions.
Those are a really interesting question indeed. This conflict between kind of almost outsourcing human rights enforcement through due diligence, etc., and shifting the responsibility to businesses, which in turn could chip away at this idea that human rights are, as you said, Siobhán, just the law and shouldn't be part of a trade-off between, you know, in a supply chain. But maybe, Christina, we can start the discussion with you. How, you know, we've heard from different practices of how important or not important human rights are in investment decisions, in finance, and in trade. Do you, in human rights dialogues with countries, see these arguments or see this this development of having more human rights in economic discussions as do you see these people as allies? Is this a useful lever? Do you use that in the discussions, or is it completely separate?
Yeah. As mentioned, so we are having a couple of political dialogues as EU with third countries. That's how we call non-EU member states. And we have human rights dialogues. So these are two different categories. The human rights dialogues, there are different levels and forms. They can be either at capital-based or headquarters-based, or they can be also at the local level. Economics plays an important part when we talk about human rights with countries, but more from the side of whether these countries comply with what is law, namely with what they have signed up to. So Ignacio mentioned conventions of the ILO. There are core conventions and non-core conventions of the ILO. So this is one point. Another point, just to give you some concrete examples, would be how do they deal with all the treaty body recommendations of the Human Rights Council. We mentioned, for instance, environment. Also today, so do they comply with it? You know that, for instance, at the Human Rights Council, to give you another concrete example, we have the so-called UPR, Universal Periodic Review, where each and every UN member state is undergoing this review on a regular basis, and there are recommendations that are coming out of these reviews. So this would be a tool which we are using in our human rights dialogues with third countries, to remind them of their recommendations and to see whether did they comply with it, and if not, why not, and what can we also do to help them. And there I joined the point also Ignacio made before. There we can act as an incentive giver to these countries, so we can ask them, how can we help you? This is then under the heading of capacity building. But just to be clear, because you mentioned, Jakob, at the beginning, this a bit, I think you alluded a bit to this development-based approach. Mm-hmm. And there, just let me be clear. So for the European Union, we argue clearly for a human rights-based approach, or a rights-based approach. So what does this mean? So there can be no... there is an interdependence, again, between these two processes. Of course, we want, through our development cooperation, through economic and trade incentives, to help foster development, to help the implementation of the SDGs for everyone and everywhere. But we are clear that this needs to be based on a rights-based approach, namely, remind everyone to what the governments have signed up to. And I think in the previous panel we heard that it's first and foremost for the government's duties to protect and preserve human rights. So this is something which we are using as a leverage and reminding them. So a sole development-based approach is not how we see also things being able to move forward for the better of the citizens.
From the EU side, right? Mm-hmm. But from other countries, you are hearing a bit more these arguments of a development-based approach.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. But then when we think of how can we engage with them in a dialogue, so we want to build alliances with everyone, of course. But why do we want to build alliances? So as to implement the SDGs, so as to make the situation more safe and more secure for the citizens in each and every country. When we're discussing economics, there is also a clear linkage to human rights in the sense that when you have a country, a society which respects human rights and where the basic fundamental rights are being respected, this is an incentive also for economic investors to come in. They will find an environment that is secure and that is safe enough to be able to invest. So there is also this connection, but it cannot. I mean, these two are interdependent. Also, these two arguments, and of course, we hear these arguments that it should be solely on development. But there, the answer is clear. This is not a possibility. Also, because we all signed up to the UDHR, which foresees also both elements.
How do you? How should I imagine that in practice when you're sitting with representatives of these countries, and you realize that, for example, certain core conventions of the ILO that both parties signed up to haven't been ratified, and for example, forced labor ban, or let's take that as an example. What would you say in those kind of dialogues? Would you only remind them of their own commitments, or could you also sometimes point to, you also signed up to this as part of a free trade agreement, and that includes a bit more enforcement possibilities?
Sure, I think we do both. So very concretely, very concretely, both sides, by the way, have a list. So it's not only that the EU comes with its list, and it is certainly not, and that's a message I'd like to convey today. It is not that we think we are perfect as European Union. We are far from being perfect. And we want to reach out to others. However, it does not mean that everyone is equally imperfect. Concretely, that means that both sides would have a list, and we would simply go through the list in a very open and cooperative way. And basically, each and every side explains why there are still some deficiencies, maybe in topic A or topic B. But then we also, what we then do, we try to use elements from the international human rights law, such as I mentioned, for instance, the UPR recommendations. We are referring to clauses that are in trade agreements and that these countries have signed up to.
So you do refer to
sure.
trade agreements as well.
But and let me add one point. We are often discussing this against the background that this is just soft law. Yes, but there is an element of peer pressure, and I think this is a relevant argument. This is something we try to use as well. We try to use it for countries in certain regions to say, how is this regional approach? And plus, last but not least, how can we help to make that work? But we also get tricky questions from the other side.
Have you had cases where that has worked, or where you have escalated or at least cooperated with trade negotiators or ministers, on economic ministers, finance ministers, and raised certain human rights concerns that then kind of would be mentioned at that level as well?
Yeah, I think the crucial point in these negotiations is less once everything is signed. I think a crucial part is during the negotiation process, where you can, which was also mentioned too, this takes quite long, and without surprise, negotiating human rights clauses might be one of the most tricky parts. So this is where you can use a bit more of leverage and maybe put a bit more pressure. Otherwise,
so you would say during the negotiation of the...
Yes, and in the run-up to the agreement.
Ignacio, can you explain from your experience how big of a deal these human rights clauses are in the overall negotiation of a free trade agreement? Does it depend on the country? Are they easy to negotiate or hard?
They are hard to negotiate also because it's something which is very European specific. I don't think I know of any other trading partner that insists that in order to conclude a trade agreement, there should be a human rights clause, and that this human rights clause can result in the suspension of trade agreement. This is something that only the European Union does. So the first thing that you need to do, you really need to be very pedagogic, explain why this is important. As it's primarily a job of our colleagues in the EIS who have to, because normally, I mean, the way that it's institutionally established, normally these human rights clauses should not be part of the trade agreement, should be part of a broad association agreement or of a political agreement. So you only need to negotiate it in a trade agreement if this is a country that has no broad agreement with the European Union or does not want to have a broad trade agreement with the European Union. So that's the first thing. You really need to explain why this is politically important for the European Union, how it is actually going to be applied in practice, etc., etc. I mean, I haven't had experience of many of those negotiations. I said I was a little bit involved in the Korea case because we had these parallel negotiations between the political agreement and the trade agreement. I know that paradoxically, some of the countries which are more reluctant on this are fellow democratic countries from the West, because they find it a little bit insulting that we pretend that they need to take those human rights commitments. If you actually look into human rights clauses in trade agreements, you would see that some of the human rights clauses that are perhaps a little bit weaker are with fellow democratic countries in the West, like Japan, Australia, etc. I was not involved in those negotiations. I guess they were quite difficult.
That's super interesting. Siobhán, would you say that this plays a role also within the EU? Because the Fundamental Rights Agency looks mostly at countries within the EU. Do you see differences between EU countries and economic arguments being used for human rights, and also vice versa? Do you see this pushback that we mentioned, for example, from countries like China, this argument that the right to development trumps everything? Is that maybe in the EU's neighborhood, in the Balkans, or even within EU member countries like Hungary, would these arguments play a role?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So a couple of reflections on that. You're right that the Fundamental Rights Agency has a mandate to advise and study and provide policy support with respect to fundamental rights within the EU. And that's fairly carefully monitored, I would say, that limitation on mandate. A couple of reflections, though. I mean, we work a lot on the applicability of the Charter to various areas, that being sort of the governing frame, the legal basis, so far as the EU primary law. We don't have a monitoring or compliance function, but it's much more of a support, a legal and policy support function. What is interesting, though, is that, and I'm only a year in FRA, I should say, so it's a relatively short experience to draw from, is that in substantive policy files, there's an assumption that the policies should be rights-based, but very little in terms of an actual policy that you could point to, like the UN Common Understanding or some certain other development actors, bilaterals in particular, have human rights-based approaches enshrined in policy that we don't have in the EU. And so I'm watching that with interest, because I don't think it's a huge problem, but it is a gap that I see. There's always a clear line from EAS and in trade and in human rights dialogues, quite clear under EAS, for example. There's a lot of guidance there, but internally less so, and not a policy that you can point to. The Charter, yes, of course, EU primary law and secondary law also, but that link to me, that sort of the policy frame and the basis doesn't seem to be there. I wanted to point to something that has come up in a couple of the interventions that I think is important, because, again, it relates to FRA's role, and that would be with respect to business and human rights. When I was thinking again about answering your question about the degree to which human rights norms and discourse had become more prominent, I know I gave a rather pessimistic or skeptical, maybe or critical view anyway of it at the outset, but what I would say is that there's an arc, there's a definite evolution. And what I've found as a public lawyer really remarkable is that, and a bit ironic, is that the BHR, the business and human rights space, has led the way. So it is interesting to see that it's now, understanding, of course, the distinction, important distinction between the obligations of states and the responsibility of business, which exist, you know, in a complementary fashion, coexist. It's still remarkable that regulation of the private sector has actually propelled our legal discourse in terms of unifying economic law with fundamental rights law. And of course, the CSDDD, as all of you know, has just been voted on by the Parliament. We wait. We're not taking any chances or assuming anything because it was such a long process. But once transposed, it will have significant impact. And I was recently in the US at a meeting of corporate lawyers, and the whole of that community is looking to the EU for leadership globally and expecting a great deal. They were talking about the Brussels effect, and I thought, well, what about the Vienna effect? Because we're here in FRA looking also at business and human rights. And just to close on that point, we have a role in the CSDDD. So as you know, there is a host of directives, including forced labor regulation. There's the corporate reporting directive also, on which the CSDDD builds. But within the CSDDD, FRA has a role to be supporting the Commission, can be asked by the Commission as the Commission develops both sector-agnostic and sector-specific guidelines for regulatory and supervisory authorities. And so that's a pretty big, those of you who have looked at the text of the directive, while it's excellent, it leaves a lot of discretion. There's a lot of guidance still needed, a lot of guidelines in particular, but guidance also on the what of a human rights impact assessment. What does human rights due diligence actually involve? So
just to explain, the CSDDD is due diligence for supply chains.
It's much broader than that. It requires that companies with over 1,000 employees and 450 million euro annual turnover have conduct human rights due diligence. It covers social, it covers human rights, it covers environment. It requires the establishment of a policy to carry out risk assessments, to mitigate those risks, to monitor them. And the annex of the directive includes a very wide range of different human rights treaties and specific human rights, adverse impacts on which are supposed to be assessed and mitigated. Now, some would say that it's a size-based approach, looking at the size of the company rather than the risk, so there's no differentiation in terms of what are considered high-risk sectors, as there might be under, for example, the UN guiding principles. But nevertheless, it does take a graduated approach. It'll be 2 years after it's adopted that states will be required to transpose it, and after that, only the largest companies will be bound. So there's a sort of a phased approach, gradually reaching to SMEs within 5 years. So that was part of the compromise to reach it. But FRA does have a project on that. Just to say, we have a project on the CSDDD and corporate sustainability, which is why I have to leave to explain to the management board what we're doing.
You have to leave in
shortly.
Five,
yes,
10
probably.
Maximum,
I'm so
right?
sorry. Yeah.
So before you leave, maybe you can explain to us a bit more how this works in practice. So it's not a certification-based process. It's a obligation on each company, or especially on large companies, to mitigate risks.
Correct.
What's the legal standard? How can you prove that a company has not done enough, and what happens if they haven't?
Great question, and I think that will be my answer is a short one, because so much of the answer to that question will lie in the guidelines, in what actual concrete guidance is produced by the Commission, by the company law unit within DG Just, which is responsible for that, for elaborating that guidance. It will involve, though, an enormous amount of. There's been discussion of technical assistance, of upskilling. There's going to be a huge amount of work to do to help not just companies, but also supervisory bodies within member states. We were struck by the fact that this is an extraordinarily positive and ambitious legislative achievement, but it also leaves a lot of questions in terms of the fundamental rights aspects. I mean, how do you define an adverse impact? Which rights do you integrate? Should it be, should it just be those that you deem directly relevant, or could it be those way down the supply chain? So an awful lot of it has to be worked out. And I think somebody else had made a comment about how, I think it was a colleague from EIB, we have to be really aware of also how busy this space has become. I mean, regulatory space has become. You have pre-existing UN soft law standards in the UNGPs, but you have guidelines, OECD guidelines, then now EU regulation, but also a host of member states have themselves in their national laws, I mean, Germany being one, France another, that already have due diligence laws on the books. And I don't think that's a bad thing. It just means that there's a lot of work for lawyers, and there's a need to take a holistic view, because the coherence question will come up again and again. And that's just on business and human rights. And you think that there are also all of the treaties that member states have ratified are also relevant. They're not suspended just because you're dealing with business. The UN guiding principles on business and human rights are very clear that states have obligations relative to business, so especially with the duty to protect, which is a positive duty derived from public international law, from human rights law, and that is directly relevant. It's a key element of the UNGPs. The newer element in the GPs and is the responsibility of business. But you raised the point. I don't think they supplant one another. They're supposed to exist alongside one another and operate in a complementary fashion. Nothing displaces the state obligation to protect from third-party interference, namely companies.
And that's a good point. So we've mentioned the due diligence as one of the EU's autonomous measures. Then there's also, more specifically, the forced labor ban.
Regulation has just come into play. It's only just been adopted. It's product-based, though, so
right.
A bit narrower. And
that's narrow, but also stricter, because it could ban imports, right?
Ultimately, if it's enforced the way it's intended to be, I think they'll be looking to. We haven't started work on that yet, but I imagine that there'll be a lot of consideration of the experience with the US has similar legislation and enforces it quite aggressively. UK also. So there is experience to draw from, but we haven't started our exercise on that. Yeah.
Maybe I can ask Ignacio, because I think the US enforcement is basically
on my customs.
Customs, exactly. Would that be how the EU would enforce this forced labor ban? Or do you?
No, I think, well, first, I'm not a big expert. Yeah. No, first, I'm not really an expert on the forced labor legislation, so I'm not sure I can really illuminate you exactly about the way that this is actually going to be enforced. It is certainly quite different from the way that the forced labor legislation is basically enforced in the United States, which is basically through the vault of customs. By the way, the forced labor legislation does not apply only to imports. It also applies to any products manufactured in the European Union on which there is evidence of forced labor. So it's not just a measure which applies to imported products. Now, but exactly what is the way in the legislation is going to be enforced, the role of due diligence obligations by the companies, all of that, I think, as I said, I'm not really sufficiently of an expert to give you a detailed readout on that.
Okay, so we've mentioned due diligence, forced labor ban, but then there's also, and we've already mentioned that within the trade agreements, the trade and sustainable development chapters, those in theory also have maybe, I mean, depends on the one with New Zealand comes with sanctions, the others are more, I don't know if you would call that a sanction, but basically you can suspend obligations or the entire trade part. Has that ever happened? What would need to happen for the EU to actually trigger this suspension?
Well, the first Trade and Sustainable Development chapter that includes the possibility of a sanction is the agreement with New Zealand, where the sanction is envisaged as a last resort if there is evidence of serious breaches of the fundamental labor rights, or if there is evidence of a material breach of the Paris Agreement. I think those are the two circumstances where there is the possibility at the end of a dispute settlement procedure, if all other avenues to solve the issue have not been solved, the possibility to apply the sanction. Now, all our other trade and sustainable development chapters include legally binding obligations, which, by the way, are broader. It's not just the two instances which I have mentioned, include a dispute settlement procedure, and following the dispute settlement procedure, then in principle, you engage in a dialogue with the country with a view to try to secure the compliance. I mean, so far, we have actually activated the dispute settlement procedure in one particular case, in the case of Korea. And this was due to the fact that Korea had not ratified 3 of the core ILO conventions that they had committed to ratify in our trade agreement. And after no progress had been achieved for a period of time, we decided that we had to bring this to a dispute settlement case. Now, the dispute settlement case was successful. It was found that Korea was in breach of their obligations under the trade agreement. And as a result of that, Korea rather rapidly ratified 2 of the ILO conventions that it had not ratified. And there are still discussions concerning the one ILO convention where there are some particularly difficult issues which have to do with the relationship between North Korea and South Korea. So I would argue, quite frankly, this is a good example of an effective use of our trade and sustainable development chapters, even if the possibility of a trade sanction is not there. And quite frankly, the peer pressure that comes from this procedure is much more important than the trade sanction. When you have had the possibility of applying trade sanctions and the agreement with Korea, it would have been a ridiculously small trade sanction, because the actual impact on trade of the breaches of the fact that they have not ratified those ILO conventions was extremely difficult to measure. So
because the sanction would always be proportional to...
Well, any sanction under international economic law always have to be in some way proportional to the trade impact of the breach.
Even for investment.
Sorry?
Even in investment dispute.
I think so. Perhaps, yes. Okay.
So
but I mean, in any case, to be very frank, I personally find that this whole debate about sanctions and TSD chapters is a little bit not so totally relevant. I mean, I think we are actually now facing a situation which is quite distinct to the one that we had 10 years ago. Now, we have legislated so much autonomously in terms of the actions that we can take on the basis of our autonomous legislation, that if there are concerns about human rights linked to a certain product coming into the European Union, if there are concerns relating to deforestation, if there are concerns relating to climate change, you have robust domestic legislation that can tackle those concerns. So that increasingly the interest of bringing these issues into a trade agreement is not just an interest coming from the European Union, it's also increasingly an interest coming from the third country, because they see the trade agreement opens an opportunity to discuss in a different manner the way that this European Union legislation is going to be implemented, and it creates a certain avenue for dialogue and cooperation on the implementation of our autonomous instruments. And I think that's increasingly becoming, in my view, more significant than this question whether at the end of the day you have a sanction or you don't have a sanction when it comes to the application of your law.
But didn't that, because just to explain, there was a lot of pushback from the European Parliament specifically that wanted sanctions to be included for the enforcement of trade and sustainable, because trade and sustainable development chapters until now were always excluded from the sanctions mechanism that applies to all the other chapters.
There was a big debate on this, and we did a review of the policy in 2022.
So with New Zealand, it's the first agreement that
New Zealand is the first agreement where we have actually included this possibility of having sanctions as a last resort.
And wouldn't you say that this whole debate forced the Commission to be to, for the first time, trigger this dispute settlement with Korea, which does not include sanctions, but because it needed to prove that its current system, which it was trying to defend, can deliver results, which it hadn't for decades?
Well, first, do not do not overemphasize the time that it took to launch a case vis-à-vis Korea. And let me just give you another example. The United States has a sanctions-based approach. The United States has a free trade agreement with Korea, which they could have invoked at any point in time to complain about the issues that we brought the complaint. They never took any action under their free trade agreement with Korea. The United States tried to apply the sanction-based approach in their agreement with Guatemala and failed because they were not able to demonstrate that there was a trade impact linked to the labor breaches. So I would argue, quite frankly, that having the possibility of a sanction is not really the most important issue. It is much more the political will to activate the procedures.
But my point is, didn't the political will come from the Commission trying to defend its approach, which clearly was preferring not to have sanctions? Because, of course, the pushback from the Parliament and civil society was, well, if you think that your current approach works, why have you never triggered the dispute? Why have we not?
Clearly, there was a certain political dimension that we obviously had to demonstrate that the approach that we have actually developed in these agreements was an approach that could actually work. And that's, by the way, not only on the Korea case. I mean, one of the things that we have actually done is to develop guidelines for the complaints that can be brought as the basis to activate our mechanisms under trade agreements. I mean, I mentioned that after the case that we had with Korea, we revised the guidelines for complaints to explain how this complaint procedure can be used to invoke potential problems, not only under the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter, also under the GSP. And this has already been used by an NGO that brought a complaint relating to mining labor rights in Colombia and Peru. And on the basis of that complaint, we have started discussions with both Colombia and Peru about how they could actually improve the practices in those areas. So I think, as I said, my sense, it is true that some political groups in the European Parliament were particularly emphasizing the issue of sanctions. And when we actually did a review of the policies, we agreed that our objective should be, in principle, to try to get countries to agree to the possibility of sanctions as a last resort. We got an agreement on that with New Zealand. Quite frankly, the real interesting question is, if you are not able to agree on sanctions with some of the big emerging countries that we are currently engaged in discussion, is that a sufficient reason to say it is not worthwhile to conclude an agreement because they cannot agree of the sanction? Or is it better to conclude the agreement knowing that you in any case have autonomous tools that allow you to take the action if you need to take the action, and that the agreement gives you an extra possibility of influencing what the country is doing? So I think that in a way is the more interesting question. And as I said, some of the agreements that we have at this point in time in the pipeline are with some big developing emerging economies, which are democratic countries, Brazil, Mercosur, Indonesia, India. And I think that's the big question that one would need to decide at some point in time. Is it better to conclude an agreement with a Trade and Sustainable Development chapter that is binding, maybe not with a sanction, or because they are not able to agree on a sanction, we say then we cannot conclude an agreement.
But ironically, the whole debate on sanctions is actually leading to more enforcement also of the agreements that did not yet have sanctions, like the one you mentioned with Korea. So maybe we're seeing a different practice now of going back to these chapters that don't include sanctions, but actually enforcing them a bit, or using them, at least escalating.
Just to give a sense, it's not such a recent thing. I mean, our case against Korea, I think, was launched already when Cecilia Malmström was our trade commissioner. So I think it's already quite some time that we came to the view that we have to be much more proactive if you want in terms of our enforcement policy. By the way, we are much more proactive in terms of enforcement, the TSD chapters, than any other chapter of our trade agreements. It's not like we are actually continuously launching dispute settlement cases under the different parts of our trade agreements. we have launched one case against Korea because of lack of compliance with the TSD chapter. We launched a case against Ukraine some time ago because of some concerns about export restrictions, and I think a case against Canada. Canada, that must be quite recent.
Was it a case, or at least a discussion about the wine?
Well, there are always discussions. I mean, you have many, many issues that you actually discuss. You are continually discussing concerns about labor rights whenever you have the yearly meetings of the Trade and Sustainable Development Committee, but actually launching a dispute settlement case under bilateral trade agreement is extremely rare. It's not that something that we are doing all the time, and at least one of the 3 cases that we have actually launched is a TSD-related case. And now, as I said, we always prefer to solve issues without dispute settlement through discussion, negotiations, and that's why in the case of Peru, I think we already have agreed with Peru on a number of ways in which they would improve their labor right practices, and I understand that we are quite close also in terms of our discussions with Colombia.
Just to explain for everyone, TSD is a Trade and Sustainable Development,
yes.
So the ILO conventions and Paris Agreement, as you mentioned. Christina, I think you...
Yeah, no, to come back a bit to this question of sanctions, maybe in the UN context a bit, and how effective our policy on human rights in the UN is. Of course, in the UN, sanctions are being dealt with and decided upon by the Security Council. So the Human Rights Council does not have sanctions. But again, it is not only about sanctions. I think so. This is a bit an argument I would like to highlight, but in a different forum. We discussed about peer pressure. We discussed about the Universal Periodic Review. We also, let me just mention the system of different special rapporteurs the Human Rights Council has, entre autres, special rapporteur dealing with environmental issues. So this is part of a global dialogue we as EU want to have and we want to engage in with our friends and partners from the South via these instruments. And this is without putting sanctions as such, but let alone the discussion, and business and human rights was mentioned before, let alone to have this discussion that are ongoing in some cases for many years, fosters an environment where not out of the blue, you discuss issues that are relevant so as to improve the human rights situation in different countries, such as environmental issues. Deforestation was mentioned, which has a clear human rights aspect. And let me add that for us, for the European Union, we discuss a lot what we have as what we call as autonomous legislation. But the next step is for us to make that work on the global level, to try to export this on the global level, not without discussing or entering into a partnership-based deliberation process with the South. But for us, this is now how can we instill this into the ongoing processes. We mentioned the Summit of the Future, the SDG process. Next year, the UN is preparing for a social summit in 2025. Obviously, very much related to the topics we're discussing here, human rights, economic aspects. And this is, frankly speaking, a very challenging process also to get a discussion on these standards. We have the same issue also within the OECD. The OECD has a study side and then producing studies, but it has also a clear standard and norm setting side. Think of the Anti-Bribery Convention. Think of the corporate sustainability guidelines I mentioned. So, and there, think of the taxes, which was mentioned in the I think it was mentioned by the High Commissioner for Human Rights in his welcome message. So there, the issue is also how can we instill this? Can we instill this in a broader, in more global context? And if so, how? And how can we have others on board also from the South? You mentioned big players from the South. We want to have them on board. We know that not everything we as EU do is transposable to other countries, but parts of it might be. And we want to engage in this discussion so as to see whether the standards that at UN level are being set cannot be a bit higher than at the beginning of different UN discussions.
Laura, I don't want to do too much online discrimination. Do you want to add to this? And if not, I have a question for you.
No, indeed. Thank you very much. I was trying to signal, but indeed, I agree very much with the words of Christina and Ignacio, where it's not only about the sanctions, the rules, how we enforce these rules, but it's also about this positive engagement when it comes particularly to countries outside EU. How do we support development, and how do our standards increasingly support this development? So, as the EU Bank, of course, we work together with the services of the Commission, and we engage. Mostly, we focus on individual investment and projects, but we are, sitting at the same table when we do this, and it's of course a positive incentive. So we do see a very important role for IFIs, for European IFIs in the Team Europe approach on exporting these standards, supporting these standards. And I don't see a trade-off between, I was mentioning before, supporting European interests and economic interests as well as human rights and other broader standards. I also see, I mentioned before this market leadership. The market, so there are a number of regulations coming up, there are a number of regulations existing, but we do see this interest and willingness of the market to engage, looking for how can we best implement this that improves sustainability and transparency. On our side, there are areas, deforestation was mentioned, and for example, the bank has a policy when it comes to counterparts, but we do not engage with counterparts that have a number of incompatible activities, mostly around climate, but for example, deforestation and incompatibility with EU rules on deforestation, regardless of the project we support of this corporate, is an activity which is incompatible with us engaging with our counterpart. So kind of a leading role there. Another area is, of course, if you look at the climate taxonomy and sustainable finance, you see that this is not limited to environmental and climate because it's based on 3 pillars. And the third pillar is minimum social safeguard entrenched in the OECD guidelines. So it's a broad set of requirements where I see market is willing to engage, but market really needs clarity in how this can be implemented. So that's, yeah.
Maybe I wanted to ask one last question to all of you before moving to the Q&A because we're running out of time. But what we wanted to discuss, I don't think we wanted to have an overarching answer, but was, how has there been a change in the last years and decades? And I would actually like to ask all of you, whoever wants to comment, do you think has there been our economic practice of human rights and investment, trade, are they more interlinked now in your experience?
Well, for me the fundamental change is that at this point in time the European Union has adopted the most ambitious policy anywhere in terms of conditioning access to its market to compliance with a number of requirements relating to either the environment or the human rights. I mean, when you look combined the impact of the border carbon adjustment measure, the impact of the deforestation legislation, the impact of the forced labor legislation, the impact on corporate due diligence, and you look at this from the perspective of a country exporting to the European Union, particularly if we are looking into a country of the Global South, and particularly if we are looking into a democratic country of the Global South, I think this has quite an impact. And I think that's something that we really need to be able to internalize in our policy making, not to change the policy, because I think the policy is right, but to find a way to make sure that we have the tools to discuss and dialogue those issues with our countries, because if just think that's just been a purely unilateral imposition, that's going to make it impossible to create bridges to discuss these issues with the current, which in the current geopolitical environment, we need to be able to work with, because otherwise it's going to be very, very difficult.
So as we mentioned in the discussion beforehand, this could even, all these autonomous measures could actually be an incentive for countries to sign on to trade agreements with the EU, because that would give them a bit more agency in how these provisions are applied.
If we manage our trade policy intelligently, yes.
But it's still an if. Christina.
Yes, look, I think a couple of points of what has changed compared to 20 years ago. I think 20 years ago, those of us, and I also see my colleague, the Austrian human rights director here, we both started nearly at the same time in the foreign ministry, nearly 30 years ago now. Look, when we started and when we were educated in multilateral diplomacy, we both worked back then in the Directorate for United Nations. We grew up, we were educated in, let's say, in the honeymoon times of multilateralism. Yeah, multilateralism was working.
So WTO.
For WTO is not part of the Austrian foreign, but the UN. So we were there in the big times of the UN. And what has changed since then? Multilateralism is in a crisis. I'm not saying that it does not work. On the contrary, and if it does not work, we all here need to make it work. That's a clear statement from my side. But given the multifaceted and the different sort of crisis, the triple crisis, the quadruple crisis we are currently facing, the multilateralism is under attack. So I think this is one big thing, one first message. The second message is that we lost somehow, and not just us, everyone seemed to have lost a bit the trust in both the multilateral system, in governments. We've lost the trust in between ourselves, in between citizens. So there is a lot to be done there to rebuild trust. This is a big thing compared to 20 or 25 years ago. The third point I'd like to mention is that we really need to recommit to human rights. And we need to recommit what we have on the table and what we have all signed up to. And I refer again to the UDHR and the BDPA. We need to recommend to the also to our legal obligations. Pacta sunt servanda. This is still very very relevant. And let me add one more element. I think what also has changed is that we all understand, the global community understands that we need to work in a nexus form. We cannot tackle global challenges in working only in one field. It cannot only be tackled. You cannot implement SDGs by only looking at the human rights field or only looking at environment or at AI, for instance. We need to work in nexus. Human rights, economics, climate change, environment. This is security, safety. This is one of the nexuses in which we're working. And let me say one last point. I think at the European External Action Service, which was created in 2009, we really tried to have a coherent and consistent foreign policy. And there, I think we've become much better. This is maybe also a change towards before, in coordinating internally on proposals the Commission is working on, for instance, deforestation. I remember well, we now have a system within the Commission EAS where we can come in as EAS from the side of the external relevance and the external factors. You cannot discuss deforestation without being aware of what's going on the indigenous rights, of what is going on in the broader UN context. So I think this is also a difference.
I want to open up for the last minutes to questions from the audience.
Jakob, before you do that, I wanted just to rectify something you mentioned, because you said the bank, the European Investment Bank, will finance ammunition and weapons. and this is not correct. In fact, the European Investment Bank... Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, yeah.
So we did indeed, our board has supported our new action plan in terms of engaging and stepping up our support to the security and defense industries, but there is a clear emphasis on safeguarding our financing capacity and ensuring highest environmental, social, and governance standards. So our approach remains focused on dual use. We do not change our exclusion policies when it comes to ammunition and weapons.
Sorry,
I just wanted to
dual use, but
it's important for us.
Okay, that's a very important distinction. But it is dual use goods that could be used for weapons production, particularly for No. Okay.
It's dual use good, and so we are talking about, for example, protections of infrastructure. We are talking about autonomous vehicles that can be used both for application, civil application in extreme areas. We are looking at drones, we are looking at jamming, we're looking at protection of airports. So it's this type of technologies. We're not looking at ammunition and weapons, whether it is research and development, productions, or trade.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. And so if we have questions from the public, from the audience? We do have one over here.
Hi, I would have a questions for both of the speakers. First, thank you very much for such a lovely insight. Somebody who is not into this topic, I really love it, and I love the implementation of the sanctions and human rights law violations and economy that comes together. So my following question will be regarding that. I'm following Republika Srpska and Bosnia and Herzegovina very closely. What's going on there? There's pre-negotiations that are open with that country. There are some presidents over there and also the staff of the office which were bullying economically, and human rights violations were implemented on them on economical level. And it means they have an ambassador, Murphy, which is American ambassador, which implemented the sanction of the persons that are working in a public institution of one state, and it means they are not able to get the salaries anymore because America bullied the country with the sanctions, and they was blocking their bills, so they're not anymore able to get the salary. It's a highly violation of the human rights there. And what is also going on, how they bully it, it's a process of a SWIFT. So actually, they threatened them with the SWIFT code closing to the banks. So the banks was pressured to close the certain bills of the public institutions' employees.
Who did?
The America,
so
the United States did it in Bosnia and Herzegovina, specifically to some people which are working in the Republika Srpska at the president's office. So that's a highly violation of the human rights because they're not able to get their salaries anymore.
So what's the question?
The question is, because this country is actually in pre-negotiation with the European Union, how is it possible that one ambassador bully the banks and put the sanction on the certain people of one country? So that's for me completely unillegal, and it's a highly violation of the human rights.
I'm not sure. So it would be a question for the U.S. ambassador, right?
No, it's actually a question from the perspective how that's possible. How that's even possible, and isn't that really a violation of the human rights? It's my question actually to you here to open me an eye. How is it possible to implement the sanctions and violate the human rights at the same time? I hope you got the question
I don't know if
properly.
any of the panelists are ready to answer that question, because it's...
I mean, maybe thanks a lot for the question, and thanks for the active participation in this panel. Just for me to understand, but which ambassador is this? Is the U.S. ambassador? You're referring to the U.S. ambassador?
In Bosnia and Herzegovina.
But that's a U.S. ambassador. Okay. I understood.
In a pre-European country, basically, which will be a soon European member, and close the bank's account to the people, threatening them to closing the SWIFT to the banks. So the banks needed to close up the bills from the people, and they could not get their salaries anymore. It's a high violation of the human rights. I'm sorry. If you cannot get your existence and have your salary, it's a huge problem. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think it's hard for the panel to
I think it's rather a question addressed probably to the US than to us as EU, and also not to our EU delegation that is there on the ground. But I get your point. How is this possible in the pre-accession?
I would just tell that EU should take Balkan countries, and especially Bosnia and Herzegovina, not anymore as a pre-yard of the European Union, because negotiations are opened last month, and I think it's a question to European Union and not to United States, which are on another continent. There's the whole Atlantic between. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think we're going to move on to another question, because we got the point, but there's hard to add to that.
I have one question to Ms. Piovesan, relating in particular to investment and the guidelines you said that the EIB is developing. The question is, I know that most of the investment of the EIB is in Europe, but some of it is for development purposes. So I was wondering to what extent the EIB works with partners from the partner countries in developing those guidelines to make sure that companies, particularly small and medium enterprises in particularly the developing world, can comply with the guidelines without running into enormous compliance problems.
Thank you. Indeed, I mentioned, we indeed are, the core of our activities are with the European Union in terms of volume, but in terms of effort, of course, we have a line which is called EIB Global, which indeed operates across the world. So our standards, which covers environmental, social, and climate, relate both to the inside EU and the outside EU. Inside EU, our standards are enshrined in EU laws and EU principles. Outside EU, we apply these principles, we base ourselves on these principles, as well as on best practices, and we align as much as possible with the other multilateral development bank to ensure that indeed when we are acting in countries, we do not come with different and incompatible sets of standards. So we do see that a lot of the things that have been mentioned today, not only on human rights, but per se in the investment, but also throughout the supply chain, are concerns that are shared by all the MDBs. Now, I mentioned also that engaging with the civil society, engaging with the partner countries is crucial when we look at how we operationalize this. So indeed, as our standards are mirrored, but we have two parts in our standards, inside EU and outside EU. And of course, in the guidance, we do engage with partner countries on how to make sure that this is indeed a guidance that incentive-wise makes it easier for the countries to understand and apply our requirements. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you also from my end for the wonderful presentations, and also for sharing your experience within your own institution. I think that was really really a good insight for all of us. I was actually intrigued by your comment and analysis on multilateralism and the decline of it, in some sense. Huh? And my question really, and also it's a comment, perhaps we need to also think about, what we mean by multilateralism and from whose perspective. On the one hand, surely there has been a decline, but we have seen a decline in the multilateral order centered around America and Europe. But in a different part of the world, multilateralism is thriving, one would say. For instance, we spoke about developmental finance. There is, I'm sure you would know, quite a bit of initiative in the Global South, especially within BRICS, for instance, to come up with newer institutions of development finance. We have the BRICS New Development Bank, you had the AIIB. So I think when we think of a decline of a certain multilateralism, we have the European and American perspective in mind. That's one. The second thing I also would want to sort of know, and this relates to the first comment as well, is that if indeed there has been a level of breach of trust, as you rightly mentioned, and indeed there has been a breach of trust in institutions, breach of trust in governments, among citizens, in societies. And I wonder if moving forward from here to rebuild that trust within international law and institutions, whether processes that merely deal with cooperation and engagement and dialogue and so on and so forth is the only thing we can do, or should multilateralism in a different way and international economic law in a different way nonetheless deal with issues related to power, subordination, inequality, dependency, political economy, extractivism, the core and the periphery, and relationships of that nature. I think, for me, the most structural questions perhaps would determine how multilateralism and international economic law would look like in the next decades to come. Thank you.
Christina, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot for the question. So indeed, you posed two questions. So on the first, I did not say that there is a decline in multilateralism. I just said that multilateralism is under pressure and that we are facing a crisis of multilateralism. But I also said that multilateralism works, and if it does not, it is our task to make it work. And I mean in terms of the UN membership. So I mean both the South, the North, the East, the West, however you call it. So the whole UN membership, I think, has a task to make that work. Where there has been a decline is in the way maybe multilateralism is interpreted. So what is the basis of our daily work in multilateralism is a multilateralism that is based on the UN Charter and that is based on, such as the UDHR, on other relevant documents and conventions. So what is not in the interest, I think, of anyone is a sort of multilateralism à la carte, how we call it. So a multilateralism where you just pick and choose and where you do not respect the whole, the entirety of the UN Charter is not something we think is useful for anyone against the background of the implementation of the SDGs. So any violation of the UN Charter needs to be sanctioned. On the second point, on trust, I'll give you a concrete example. There is a very good document that is produced once a year by the UN Secretariat in New York, which is called the UN Human Development Report. And if you have a look at the UN Development Report, Human Development Report of 22, the interesting thing is they made a short survey of what are the main concerns of both people living in the South and in the North. And surprisingly enough, they had exactly the same concerns. So we are not so far away. One concern related to trust in governments. Another one related to economic factors, to the fact that you need to have a stable work. You need to be able to feed your family. You need to be able to have a stable income. And the third one related to health. That was, of course, in the aftermath of COVID-19. So everyone has very much shared concerns. And this, now coming to your point on the necessary reform of MDBs, of the global financial system. Indeed, if you look at the draft of the pact of the Summit of the Future, where negotiations will restart next week in New York, the first, like when you open this document, the first part is exactly on how we can ensure to have sustainable financial institutions to help make the climate, I call it now in EU terms, the Green Deal work, to help to have environmental concerns being really taken on board, etc. So I think we are in a good way. My point on that would be, let's take it as an opportunity this year. 2024 is the year where we can make reality when we speak about mainstreaming of human rights. Let's take this document and let's do a real mainstreaming of human rights through the whole document in favor and in the interest of people worldwide.
I know Ignacio wanted to add something. We're super over time, but if it's very short, then go ahead.
Just two telegraphic comments talking about multilateralism on trade. First, I would hope that when it comes to the decline of multilateralism on trade, that is really being seen as a common interest of the European Union and countries of the Global South to have a proper functioning multilateral trade institution. And the second one, I think we need to also take into account that when you talk about the BRICS, by no means the BRICS have the same point of view, at least when it comes to reform of multilateralism in the trade field. The position of India is certainly not the same as the position of China or the position of Brazil, just to give you 3 examples. So I think it's a very complicated group of interests involved, but I would hope that everyone from the Global South sees that the absence of a functioning multilateral trade institution is something which is not in the interest of the Global South.
Thanks very much. Thanks to my brilliant panel. And thanks for everyone. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you.